Tommy Forrester is dead. Tommy was going to be an engineer. He was 22, good-looking, personable, athletic. He had a high IQ. The dean said he had the best potential of any man in his class. But Tommy is dead. His problem was acid, lysergic acid formula 25, called LSD. A close friend told him LSD was psychedelic, mind-expanding, said it would give him fantastic new sensations and thrills. So Tommy tried it, and his friend was right. At first, the LSD made him sick at his stomach, but then Tommy began to hallucinate. The air began to be filled with rainbows. The very atmosphere seemed to be a moving current of multicolored particles which came streaming down around him. When he listened to the stereo, he saw colored particles floating out from the speakers. When he looked at the walls, they seemed to be melting. The pictures on the walls became liquefied with colors running down like waterfalls. It was sensational. Inside himself, Tommy felt sublimated, sort of suspended in space. He had a euphoric feeling of wonderful well-being. Then he looked in a mirror, and something horrible happened. First, it seemed that half of his face was rotting away. Then he began to see himself as a grotesque, misshapen monster. He looked around the room, and all the people were becoming monsters. Everybody knew what was happening to Tommy because he began screaming and describing what he was seeing. Tommy had the feeling he wanted to smash his head against the wall to bring himself out of this stupor. He did it. Blood spurted from his nose, and a large cut bloodied his forehead. But he felt no pain. Then he pounded his head on a doorpost. Somebody in the room tried to stop him. He felt they were his enemies, so he jerked away. He ran into the next room where an open window looked out on a roof across the street. It was 18 stories to the ground. Tommy thought to himself that the roof across the street was really just a few inches away. He could jump on it and thereby escape. He tried it. Tommy is dead. Not everyone who tries LSD for the first time gets such a violent reaction. One authority estimates that among first-time users, about 1 out of 20 will go into a traumatic nightmare such as Tommy's. As for the other 19, their reactions are unpredictable, but will range all across the emotional spectrum. For some, it will be a scintillating and exhilarating ecstasy. For others, it will be repose, even stupefying. The cult of LSD users call any of these psychedelic experiences good trips if they don't end up out of control. But they never know when a bad trip will hit them. Just about the time a user begins boasting that he has become a real acid head and suffered no real ill effects, a bad trip can sweep him into emotional oblivion. A bad trip can send him wandering down the highway seeking to merge himself with some speeding automobile. It can send him into epileptic fits, make him schizophrenic, or permanently impair his sanity. It may rob him of the will to live and terminate in suicide. Others lose a sense of identity and cannot tell where the boundaries of their own bodies separate them from their environment. With some, there is a feeling of deep despondency and an accompanying fear that it is wrong for them to go on existing. Even on so-called good trips, the acid user often becomes a serious hazard to himself. His whole sense of reality becomes distorted. He thinks he can fly like a bird or walk on water. He can look at a crack in the sidewalk and shrink back as though it were a Grand Canyon. Or he can look down from the top of a skyscraper and have the feeling it is barely inches to the ground. Scientists suspect that the LSD has its greatest impact on that part of the brain which decodes and interprets sensory impulses. By paralyzing or scrambling these sensory signals, the patterns in the brain become flamboyant, twisted, unreal. Sometimes the user thinks he can smell or taste the sound of music, or, as was the case with Tommy, he thinks he can see the music. The capacity of the brain to associate the present with the past is impaired. Perfectly familiar objects may seem completely foreign or non-identifiable. At the same time, the most bizarre associations seem to cloud the conscious mind, so that a user can be looking at a person and suddenly gain the impression that that person is dissolving away or turning into some kind of a strange monster. As with all psychedelic compounds, LSD not only diminishes the instinct of self-protection and self-preservation, but it removes the natural inhibitions. A professor of a Philadelphia university came out of his LSD spree to discover that he had been running naked and bleeding up and down the boulevard on which he lived. A prominent official of the government was found naked and freezing in the topmost branches of a backyard tree. From the point of view of the police, the problem of psychedelic drugs is not only what it can do to the user, but what a temporarily demented user often does to other people. During January of this year, 4 teenagers on a binge of LSD rammed into a house, killing a 3-year-old child. The police found the driver of the car to be in a psychedelic trance. After placing him in a jail cell, this teenager tried to climb the wall, shouting, "I'm a graham cracker. See, my arm just crumbled off." A woman in California who prided herself in being able to take LSD without any ill effects took a knife and slashed out the eyes of her child. A 30-year-old medical student who was recently apprehended for murder admitted that he had been under hallucination drugs for several days. His dazed brain was puzzled by the presence of police officers. He looked at them and said, "What have I done? Raped someone?" He had actually killed his own mother. All I have said so far about LSD is really an introduction to this recently developed acid cult compound. Nevertheless, I hope it will help you appreciate why some doctors have referred to this as one of the instant insanity drugs. LSD was not developed in the United States. It was discovered in 1938 by Dr. Albert Hofmann of the Sandoz Chemical Laboratories in Switzerland. Dr. Hofmann was doing special research with a purple fungus often found attacking rye plants. This fungus contained lysergic acid, which Dr. Hofmann was processing in a variety of ways to see if he could find something to tone up the nervous system. One of the formulas he compounded was designated as number 25. It was not until 5 years later that Dr. Hofmann discovered that his Formula 25 was a psychedelic drug. While working with it, he accidentally inhaled some of the fumes. Within a short time, he began to hallucinate. He wrote that for 2 hours he had fantastic visions of extraordinary vividness, accompanied by a kaleidoscopic display of intense coloration. This formula was immediately patented by the Sandoz Corporation, which thereby became the only legal outlet for LSD-25 in all the world. In 1949, Max Rinkel of the Massachusetts Mental Health Center introduced this drug into the United States for experimental purposes. Small doses were administered in carefully supervised situations to see if a sense of well-being or euphoria could be artificially transmitted to alcoholics and certain types of mental cases. However, it soon became apparent that LSD-25 was a highly dangerous drug. Its side effects were totally unpredictable. When used on borderline mental cases, the LSD would sometimes send patients into a prolonged psychosis requiring extended confinement in a mental institution. A pattern of suicidal tendency also appeared among patients, and others suffered from severe schizophrenia or split personalities. Worst of all, it was discovered that LSD-25 has a delayed or residual reaction which can be neither anticipated or prevented. As Dr. Duke Fisher of the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute has written, quote, "It is possible to have recurrent LSD experiences without using the drug again. We have encountered many people who have given up LSD only to find that as much as 2 years later, they are having paranoid feelings and hallucinations without taking LSD again, unquote. Over 2,000 medical reports were written on the various aspects of LSD-25, and there was so much adverse publicity concerning it that the Sandoz laboratories took it off the market. However, it was known that this compound was not difficult to produce, so it was not long before the formula developed by Dr. Hoffman was being clandestinely passed along the corridors of certain university chemistry labs. It also began to come into the country from bootleg sources in Europe. Of course, a normal dose of LSD is so potent and microscopically small that it is easily concealed. Because it is colorless as well as tasteless and odorless, it is extremely difficult to detect, especially in a liquid solution. In powder form, the normal dose of 100 micrograms is so tiny it can hardly be seen by the naked eye. In a single ounce, there are approximately 280,000 doses. This means at the going rate of $5 per dose, an ounce of LSD-25 would be worth approximately $1,400,000. In liquid form, LSD has appeared in small ampoules right on up to large bottles labeled mouthwash. Sometimes it may be found in crystalline form and packaged in capsules, or it may come as bulk powder and in the form of tablets. The latter are usually dissolved in a sweet liquid or in water and ingested, or the liquid may be soaked into a cube of sugar, an animal cracker, or a candy wafer. It has even been found in chewing gum and the gummed flaps of envelopes. A common cigarette can conceal $50,000 worth of LSD, or 10,000 doses. As we have already mentioned, this particular drug was first introduced into the United States for medical research. However, by 1963, significant quantities of LSD were being bootlegged on certain university campuses. Its promoters described it as a genuine thrill potion, something real groovy. In fact, it was in 1963 that 2 professors were discharged from Harvard University for the alleged promotion of LSD among students. They were Mr. Timothy Leary and Dr. Richard Alpert. For several years, Dr. Leary had been experimenting with exotic mushrooms from Mexico, and when LSD came along, he boasted of becoming a regular user of it. He subsequently involved Dr. Alpert, and they were both discharged after it was allegedly determined that they had involved a considerable number of students in an institutionalized acid cult. After their discharge, Dr. Leary and Dr. Alpert set up an outfit called the International Federation for Internal Freedom. For a while, they operated in Mexico, but they attracted so much undesirable attention, the Mexican government became alarmed and asked them to leave. They thereupon returned to New York, where Dr. Leary procured a 64-room mansion in Millbrook, New York, which resembled a Bavarian castle. There they set up a cultist colony called the Castalia Foundation. In December 1965, Dr. Leary was arrested at Laredo, Texas, for the illegal transportation of marijuana from Mexico to the United States. He was subsequently convicted and sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. However, the wheels of judicial appeal grind slowly, so Dr. Timothy Leary has remained at large on bond and has been enjoying unprecedented success in promoting his formula for a psychedelic adventure in acid ecstasy. In October 1966, a federal statute went into effect, making it a federal crime to manufacture or possess LSD and certain other prohibited drugs. However, the Supreme Court then ruled that the use of peyote as a psychedelic drug in the religious ceremonies of certain Indian tribes is a constitutional right which cannot be denied them. As one might have expected, Dr. Leary soon organized his own tribal religion, using LSD, peyote, and marijuana as part of the sacramental ritual. He called his new religion the League of Spiritual Discovery. According to an article in the New York Times of September 20th, 1966, Dr. Leary was demanding that the courts treat him at least as well as the Indians and allow his followers to legally consume these so-called sacred drugs of LSD, peyote, and marijuana in the private shrines of their own homes. Dr. Leary states that the goal of his new religion is to turn on, tune in, and drop out. That's a quote. He describes dropout as meaning, quote, to detach yourself harmoniously, tenderly, and gracefully from world commitments until your entire life is dedicated to worship and search, unquote. Medical authorities point out that what an acid user really does is to degenerate gradually into a mental vegetable, without ambition, without goals, and without the will to struggle. Gradually, the user withdraws more and more from social contact as the inner core of his entire personality seems to wither away. Among young people, Dr. Leary continually pushes LSD as an esoteric stimulant. He says, quote, an LSD session that doesn't involve an ultimate merging with a person of the opposite sex isn't really complete. One of the great purposes of an LSD session is sexual union, unquote. Of course, Dr. Leary knows that this acid compound is actually a sex depressant. But why should a super salesman of his national stature be concerned with such minor details? To protect himself, he always suggests that if young people don't happen to receive the promised endowment of esoteric stimulation from LSD, it may be due to the fact that they were distracted by all the rainbows and vivid colorations during the hallucination period. All authorities agree that strange mentalities like Timothy Leary and other advocates of acid ingestion are having an amazing success in converting more and more teenagers to try psychedelic drugs. Among students on a number of university campuses and sometimes even in high schools or junior high schools, taking a psychedelic trip has escalated into a status symbol. The health officer at the University of California, who is a physician, estimates that 1 of every 4 students on that campus has experimented with psychedelic drugs in one form or other. 4 high school students in New York went on a psychedelic binge, and one of the girls describes her experience. She says, quote, I was looking at my friend Linda. Suddenly feathers popped out on her skin. Her nose curved into a beak. She had an eagle's face. I looked at my boyfriend Johnny. He was turning into a bird too. So was Linda's boyfriend. We were in Central Park Zoo. I couldn't move. I wanted to cry, but no tears would come. Oh God, I heard myself yell. People really are animals. I started laughing hysterically, only inside I didn't feel funny. I started to run away from the others through Central Park until I stopped under a stone bridge. Johnny kept calling me. After a long time, I went up on the bridge. Johnny always had been my source of security. He said LSD was groovy and wouldn't hurt me. He said I'd see beautiful colors and hear musical notes, but I never did. Instead, I saw awful things. People looked like monkeys. Cracks in sidewalks became deep crevices you could fall into. Finally, after about 8 hours, the drug started to wear off. I was depressed for days afterwards. I never want to try that again, unquote. Actually, this girl was lucky. She came out of it. In a 3-month survey by the Los Angeles County General Hospital, it was found that 66% of the LSD patients brought into the clinic after a bad trip had to be classified as extended psychosis patients, meaning that they required immediate commitment to a state mental institution for prolonged treatment. One of the most recent discoveries of the respected geneticist Dr. Maimon M. Cohen is the fact that LSD not only damages the brain of the user, but it affects the human chromosomes, thereby leading to mental retardation and physical abnormalities in the offspring of LSD users. It has also been recently revealed that ever since 1955, the United States military service has been looking upon LSD as a chemical warfare bullet. They have pointed out that a single ounce of this concoction properly distributed can mentally unbalance approximately 300,000 people for a significant period of time. A few pounds of LSD dumped into the water supply of a major city would be enough to neutralize and disorient millions. This is why it has been looked upon as a chemical warfare weapon. Some 10 years ago, LSD was experimentally administered to certain military personnel without their knowledge. It was found that these troops soon ceased to function as a military force. Their discipline disintegrated into complete confusion. They were unable to respond to the most simple commands, and they could not perform the most routine tasks with any acceptable degree of accuracy. As an enemy sabotage weapon, here is the effect which it could have on a city, according to Dr. Sidney Cohen. chief psychosomatic officer of medicine at the Los Angeles Veterans Hospital. He describes it in his book entitled The Beyond Within and writes, quote, "The city exposed to a successful LSD attack presumably will cease to function. The inhabitants will be so bemused with the odd things that are happening to them and their neighbors that for half a day an aggressor force could take over without substantial resistance. A saboteur could carry enough in an overcoat pocket to produce serious temporary effects on all of the inhabitants of a megalopolis such as Los Angeles or New York, if only he could distribute it evenly. The contents of a two-seater piece of luggage will hold amounts sufficient to disable every person in the United States." Unquote. The ease with which this brain-muddling chemical could be delivered to a whole population is contained in a recent report from Los Angeles which says, quote, "Not only could it be distributed through the water supply, but it may be suspended in the air, and the inhalation is equally effective as a casualty producer." Unquote. At the present time, however, America's chemical warfare attack is not by enemies from abroad, but by enemies within. The Los Angeles Police Department reports that interviews with several thousand drug users clearly demonstrates that both young people and adults tend to follow a definite pattern of evolution as they commence with routine thrill pills and then progress gradually into heavy addiction with opiate narcotics. The Los Angeles report indicates that many young people are first exposed to neurostimulating drugs by pressure from their immediate friends and associates. The first step is to get high on some form of medicated drugs available at the corner drugstore. They discover that anything which can be used can be abused, and they set about to discover what strange sensations might emerge from overdoses of common medicines. The favorites are referred to as goofballs. The drug industry classifies these particular compounds as either amphetamines or barbiturates.